Hunters have long followed the moon to try to predict buck movement and the best days to hit the woods. Whether it be phase or moon position, many swear by it, but it is highly debated whether it actually plays a role or not. In this episode of the Deer IQ podcast, we'll look at several well-known hunters, their views on both sides of this debate and why they hold them, and strip back the bias to look at raw data and finally reveal if the moon really does affect buck movement.
Welcome to Deer IQ, here to help you hunt smarter, elevate your approach, and consistently tag exceptional whitetail. Whether you're just starting out or a longtime hunter targeting mature bucks, this is your edge. We bring you proven tactics, expert insights, and unfiltered conversations with high-level hunters who just get it done. Guiding you through it all is veteran hunter and strategist Adam Lewis, helping you spot what others miss, fine-tune your focus, and unlock your full hunting potential. So let's raise your deer IQ. Here's your host, Adam Lewis.
Hey, I'm Adam Lewis, and I've been an outdoor writer for many major magazines for over a decade and specialize in getting to the bottom of stuff like this by looking at facts and science and filtering out the bias and BS. I'm also a science teacher of 24 years, an experienced and successful hunter as well of 34 years, and will bring all that experience into this topic here in this video. But before we get to those interviews I talked about in the data, let's review the current views of the moon and what role we know it actually plays to life on Earth. Without the moon, life might not be possible on Earth. At a quarter the diameter and 1/6 the Earth's gravity, our celestial neighbor plays a critical role in setting marine life rhythms and moderating climate of our planet. Scientists have documented sea turtles relying on its light for navigation during migrations, its triggering of reproduction periods in corals and marine worms, and species like horseshoe crabs relying on new and full moons to time their crawl to shore for optimal breeding. And without its exact orbital position, the Earth would wobble like a top, having such extreme weather that we would experience deadly heat or permanent deep freeze. With such influence, it's not a stretch to think that the moon might also affect the movement of animals like white-tailed deer, and therefore be a legitimate factor for timing a successful hunt. But is it? There are numerous ideas floating around about how the moon exactly affects deer activity, many of which are conflicting. Nevertheless, the main factors hunters cite as buck influencers are the moon's phase or brightness in the sky and its position or gravitational influence or pull. The simplest and possibly oldest moon phase theory says that buck movement will decrease during a full moon because deer will feed heavily under the bright night sky. This supposedly suppresses movement the next day as deer are laid up with full stomachs, resulting in poor hunting. The more complex solunar theory looks at both phase and position, claiming that during new and full moons, buck movement will increase at times when the moon is in a minor window near the horizon or in a major window positioned overhead or underfoot, especially at dawn and dusk. And another popular moon theory amongst hunters, known as the red moon theory, says the best times for hunters are during a 4-hour window when any phase of the moon is overhead or underfoot in conjunction with a rising or setting sun. With solunar and red moon, the position of the moon and sun increases gravitational effects and somehow stirs the bucks to move early or keeps them out late, giving a slight window of opportunity for hunters to take advantage of, in theory. So let's look at how some hunters actually hunt the moon. Here's what fellow Michigander and author John Eberhart had to say when I talked to him recently. John, from your experience, how does moon affect buck movement, and why do you think that?
I'm not a moon phase believer whatsoever. I base my opinion on 59 years of bow hunting and gun hunting, some gun hunting experience in heavily pressured areas. And I guess what I have noticed over the years is when there's a full moon and there's no cloud cover, during the maybe 3 or 4 days on each side of the full moon phase, and there's no cloud cover, and I'm talking during the rut phases now.
Okay.
So I'm talking strictly during the rut phases. There's not a lot of nighttime mature buck activity out in open, vulnerable areas, at least in pressure, the type of pressure areas I hunt, because it's just too bright out in open crop fields and open areas. They just feel too vulnerable. And I also proved that back in the 70s and late 60s when I used to do a lot of shining, spotlighting deer just to look at deer. I noticed the same thing. When it was a bright moon, you'd hardly ever see a 2.5 or 3.5 year old buck. But as soon as you got some sort of rain cover or rain or cloud cover during that
Mm.
same moon phase, and as soon as you got rain or cloud cover where it was a dark night, even though it was a full moon, you saw the exact same thing as you did when it was a dark night outside of the full moon phase. And during the rut phases, when there was a full moon and the full moon was bright at night, there was a lot higher midday deer traffic, especially mature buck traffic, the next day during the rut phases again. And I believe that's because they didn't get the opportunity to go out and potentially find estrus does at night because they felt vulnerable going out into those exposed areas at night. So they made up for it the next day during midday, which is typically when big bucks move a lot during the rut phases, is midday, if you're in the right types of security cover locations.
Do you think so? You hunt all over the place. I know you're here in Michigan with me, being high pressure, but have you noticed any difference in that when you go to low pressure states? Like, is it less affected if you have a full moon or something?
I've noticed the same thing in lesser pressured
Okay.
states. And I do know that most biologist moon phase studies are done in captive enclosures, where there is no hunting. And like this John Ozaga, you know, I was going to hold this up for people looking. John Ozaga actually ran Kuzno Ranch, which is a 1 mile enclosure in northern Michigan. And he said, in the title of this is Northern Whitetail Rut, not moon phase related. So he doesn't believe in moon phase affecting deer hunting whatsoever. And he has well over 500 cases of physically watching deer breed and knowing when they breed, and the moon phase over many years didn't affect rutting activity or breeding activity whatsoever. Now, I know there's a lot of high profile TV guys that sell moon phase charts and moon phase calendars. I know Charles Alsheimer did moon phase studies, and his was also in a captive enclosure. And a lot of these guys that follow captive enclosure studies, they're hunting ultra managed properties like the TV guys. So, they're like hunting in a zoo. So those deer, because the buck to doe ratios are pretty much even, as well as the age brackets. There's probably as many 4, 5, and 6 year old does as there are 4, 5, and 6 year old bucks. So, so the deer on those ultra managed properties that they hunt pretty much replicate the same types of movements as they would in a captive environment. I mean, they're a step away from being in an enclosure, because there's some TV guys that they control, 10 to 30,000 acres of land with no hunting competition. So deer are not going to move the same there on that types of properties as they are in a pressured property or pressure area. And that goes for any kind of hunting, whether it be moon phase or whatever you're talking about, how you want security cover, or how you want open areas. Because, TV guys, they can sit in a box blind that sticks out like a sore thumb and shoot monster bucks in a picked cornfield 2 hours before dark. They have their option between 3 or 4 big bucks. That's just out of touch with the reality of real hunting. So let me finish. I know
Mm-hmm.
you're wanting to say something. So when you get these TV guys, it doesn't matter what day they hunt. Okay, they can hunt any day they want. So if they're trying to push their false rhetoric about, this is the phase of the moon you want to hunt, well, then of course what they're going to do is they're going to skew their hunting schedule to hunt on the days that fit their narrative. And obviously, because of where they're hunting, they're going to kill big bucks. So, they can say, well, I shot this buck during the red moon or during the whatever the case may be. So it fits their narrative to sell whatever rhetoric they're trying to sell to their audience that doesn't know any better. I don't know if I'm being sarcastic. I'm just being a realist. Okay. I've
Yeah.
done this for a lot of years, and I have never, ever had moon phase affect deer movements like you see on deer charts ever. If I get the time off during the rut phases, I'm hunting. I'm not going to go by my moon chart and not hunt that day, even though I got the day off, because it doesn't fit the calendar or chart I'm looking at.
Yeah. So you brought up a couple of things there, just to, I guess, expand on those or clarify. So you're talking luminosity, right? When you talk moon phase, you're typically
Yeah.
talking about how bright the moon is, and clouds will affect that, right?
Right.
So you're talking purely as a function of how bright it is out there and if they feel safe enough to expose themselves because of that, kind of, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And that's all you can really go by.
Yeah.
It's
And
what
then,
you physically see movement during daylight hours. And if because I used to go shining a lot in the 60s and 70s, I physically saw activity at night too. And it changed dramatically according to how bright the moon was, what you'd see.
so according to you, then, if it's a bright full moon night, you should potentially have better activity during the rut the next day.
If you're in the right types of secure areas, you will definitely have better activity for mature bucks the next day during the rut phases.
Right. And then the John Ozoga study is looking at the timing of the rut, right? So basically, he's saying that because of, especially up north, right, northern Michigan, with bad winters and everything, that they have to be bred at a certain time, so they have their fawns at a certain time, so they can actually survive, right?
Correct.
It can't be shifting around, or that would really hurt them.
Yeah, because over the years, the moon is not at the same dates every year. It changes from year to
Yeah.
year when the full moons are, the dark moons, whatever the heck you want to call it. And according to John's studies of over 30 years in a 1 mile enclosure, and he had visually watched over 500 breeding sessions. And he said the moon phase had nothing whatsoever to do with when they bred. He said the weather conditions, the severe winter weather conditions, affected, made sure they bred during the same dates almost every year
Yeah.
as opposed to moon phase. Because there could be a 10-day difference in a breeding cycle due to a moon phase, this year compared to 5 years from now.
Yep.
And because of the severe weather, they had to be a lot more uh, exact on the dates that they bred and bore fawns.
Okay, so that's kind of with moon phase, right? What are your thoughts on position of the moon? So there's different ideas there with phase, and then position would be underfoot or overhead. And I think that has more to do with, they're saying, the gravitational pull of the moon. So would you say, I guess from what you're saying, that has zero effect from what you've seen at all?
In my personal opinion, it's all BS. I think it's a money making scheme for the guys that put out the moon phase charts and moon phase calendars. And I've done TV commercials almost 30 years ago with a gentleman. He's dead now, but he wrote a moon phase book, and we disagreed big time while we were doing the commercial. It was for scent lot. He was a big scent lot guy.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I put no credence into anything. Studies are nice if you want to know the social activity of deer in a pristine herd, with no hunting or whatever the case may be, or if you're hunting ultra managed properties, that those are almost like studies in an enclosure, because as well as I do, that's not real hunting. And so when you're trying to pawn something off and sell your wares, uh, and try to kill deer on the dates that you suggest that they hunt, because they can go out any day and kill something. Um, obviously that's what they're going to do. They're in the money. They're in the business of making money. They are in a business. That's what they do for a living, is sell deer stuff, sell TV rhetoric. And I was in the industry for 30 some years. I know how this stuff works, and I just don't buy into any of that rhetoric, because I've proven it to myself that it doesn't make any difference in the situations where I've hunted in the past in heavily pressured public lands and free permission properties.
And some scientific research would also oppose the old "don't hunt the day after a full moon" adage. A 2013 study I found on the moon's luminosity and its effect on nighttime predation risk concluded that there was a suppressive effect of moonlight in more open habitat types across all species, since that is when animals, including deer, feel most vulnerable.
Every hunter has blind spots and weaknesses holding them back. What are yours? The Deer IQ Test 360 is our complete hunting strategy and skills assessment, designed to uncover the holes in your approach, fix them fast, and refocus your efforts on exactly what gets results. It's quick, insightful, and delivers personalized suggestions based on your unique hunter profile. If you want to consistently tag better whitetail, the Deer IQ Test 360 is where to start. Take it now, linked below or at deeriq.com.
All right, I want to introduce a new show partner that you may be interested in, 2A Display. They specialize in gun and knife displays and storage solutions that secure your weapon safely just about anywhere, so it's ready when you need it. In your truck, on your wall, on the sides or top of your gun safe for maximizing that unused space, or just for displaying your knife or gun for others to admire, 2A Display is your gun and knife display and storage solution. And get 10% off when you use code IQ on your order. See all their many options in the link below, also including magnetic ones that are really cool. Next, I'm with Adam Hayes III. With 4 bucks over 200 inches on his wall, he employs a different strategy, primarily planning local and out-of-state hunts around the red moon. In fact, he attributes so much of his success to the moon's position and pull that he bought the Moon Guide, a company producing a lunar table indicating the best times to hunt based on when the red moon falls. Here's what he had to say. Question 1 was, why do you think the moon causes increased buck movement, and by using it, hunters can gain an edge?
Well, I don't think it causes increased movement. I believe it causes increased movement because I've seen it happen, firsthand after following the moon and hunting big deer for over 30 years. I've seen it. I've witnessed it. I've owned the Moon Guide for 10 years and I've talked to hundreds, if not thousands of guys that believe the same thing and have witnessed it also. I mean, the moon is Mother Nature, and the moon affects deer. It affects everything. I mean, go into an emergency room and ask them what days of the month are the craziest nights in the ER, and it's always on the full moon. I mean, the moon affects us like, I don't even think we understand 1/10 of it. But from what I've seen, hunting for 30 years, for 45 years actually, but really hunting and following the moon for 30 years, I've seen it happen firsthand. I've seen it affect big deer. It's never one thing, and I'm not here to say it's always the moon. There are days every hunting season where the weather trumps everything. That first cold front, high pressure system, whatever that weather pattern is that increases activity, some days that's going to trump everything else. Doesn't matter what's going on. And there are days every month when the moon does the same thing. I've seen it happen. I killed my biggest buck ever on a night 2 hours before dark when it was extremely hot and there was no reason for deer to be up moving. But I had a good win for my spot, and I had a red moon that night, and that was why I happened to be halfway across the country on that specific week to try to kill that animal. So, I do believe it works. I know lots of guys that believe it works, and it's like anything else. The more tools you have in your arsenal when it comes to trying to kill big deer, it's never going to be one thing. So one day it could be the wind, one day it could be the moon, one day it could be, crops coming down. It could be hunting pressure, the rut. It could be your tactic. If you're calling deer, I mean, there's so many different factors. why would you want to put blinders on and say, I'm only going to hunt when I have this certain weather pattern? You know, you might only get a handful of days each month where you got that specific weather pattern you're looking for. What are you doing the rest of the time? You know, you are missing golden opportunities a handful of days each month where that moon is peaking at prime time. That's going to increase activity for that night. You know, it might be a weather pattern next night. You got to be able to read the room, what's going on, you know, and choose from your arsenal of weapons that you have to get the job done. So I guess in a nutshell, that's what I believe.
Okay. Recently, there was an MSU study. They came out and they looked at, moon phase. They looked at position, a lot of different factors. And from what they looked at in their data, they said, and this was, I think, four of them that worked on it, that those did not significantly affect movement. So what were your thoughts, I guess, on that study?
I have a lot of thoughts after reading it. Have a lot of things I believe, a lot of things I could say. I'm just not going to go there. The whole thing seems kind of odd to me, why somebody would go so far out of their way to try to disprove something definitively, when if I've learned anything in the last 45 years of hunting, that the only thing definitive when it comes to hunting is nothing is ever definitive. So, they can believe what they want to believe. I'm not going to sit here and try to bash their study or disprove anything. But what I am going to say is that whether it's that study or any other study that's ever been done, none of them are going to make me change my tactics or make me forget about what I've learned in the last 45 years of hunting or 30 years of paying close attention to the moon and its effects on big bucks. I know what works for me. I got the proof on my wall behind me. Nothing's going to make me forget about what I've seen, what I've learned, what I've figured out when it comes to killing big deer. I mean, if somebody wants to read a study and base everything they do in the deer woods off that study, more power to them. I know what I'm going to keep doing. I'm going to keep doing what's worked for me. And, it's not going to change what I do as far as any study goes.
Now, I have to say, Adam declined to talk about the science behind the red moon. I did find some obscure experimental research that has attempted to measure the effects of gravimetric tides, a field dynamic from the moon, sun, and earth orbits and their fields intermingling, and it suggests they may have an influence on cyclic behaviors in humans and plants. But this research is not mainstream and needs further study for validity. But the reality is the science is really what needs to be addressed to actually show if the moon plays a role or part in buck movement or not. You see, no matter how skilled, hunters can be subject to interpretation bias. After all, if we only hunt under certain conditions, we're likely to see success and attribute it to those conditions. So how do we really know if it's the moon causing the deer movements we observe, or if it's one of a long list of other complex factors? Maybe it's my lucky socks. If I always shoot a buck wearing them, I may conclude that it's my socks that caused this. But is that really true? Probably the best way to answer the moon question is to eliminate all other variables and human bias and crunch much larger whitetail data sets than hunters can compile in lifetimes. The Mississippi State University Deer Lab recently conducted such a test. Here's my talk with Dr. Bronson Strickland, former co-director of the Deer Lab, about what the study found. The first one is the moon, and this has been a huge question. You guys did some research about this at MSU there with, does the moon, whether it be the phase of the moon, whether it be the position of the moon, does that affect deer movement? And how does that relate to us hunting and making hunting decisions? So we're going to dig into that. Before we do, we were kind of chatting beforehand. I think it's really important to think about this, and I see this as a science teacher a lot. It's a very human thing, where we look at something and we have something in our head, we have a hypothesis, something we believe, and we start testing it, we start looking at data, And it's very human to make a conclusion based on what you previously thought, regardless of what the data tells you, right? It happens all the time. I see it so much. And so as we get into this, I'm not really on one side or the other. I'm more of just looking at the data. What do we find? What do we see? Try to look at it that way, I guess, is what I'll say. What does the data actually support or not? Try to remove any previous beliefs from your head. And that's the hard part as a scientist to do, that you kind of have to train yourself to do, I think. But would you agree with that, Dr. Strickland?
I would agree 100%. It is a human trait to develop a pattern that has served us well over time, human beings, to develop these patterns. The problem arises when you only have a few instances to connect the dots, and you don't have enough replication, randomization to see the full pattern. That's where we get in trouble.
Yeah, so let's talk about this study, because that is a great point. So I've been hunting 34 years. I hunt a lot every year. How often do I actually observe deer in the field and then can therefore draw conclusions? Like, how many data points, you might call those, do I have? Maybe dozens, maybe hundreds at best, right? When you start looking at GPS collars on bucks, how many data points did you guys have as you started tackling this idea of the moon?
About a million. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of data points for just about every type of moon scenario that you could imagine.
Yeah, so that's a lot more. That's a lot more than what what any person could possibly. I guess my point is, what you could possibly gather as a hunter. This is just much more data, right? So,
Right.
Just the overview of the test is what I gathered from your report, and people can download this online. Actually, just your whole report. I believe it was 48 bucks. Is that correct?
Give or take, yeah. It could have been 48 individuals. We ended up with about 60 individual years, meaning some of them were in year 1, year 2. Some of them we just had year 1 or year 2.
And this was a 2-year study, and the collars transmitted. You got data points every 15 minutes or so?
That's right, every 15 minutes.
All right. So let's, I guess, start there in just the setup of the test. We talked about bucks in general. Was there what about the age class of these bucks? And just tell me a little bit more about the location of the study so people can kind of compare.
Sure thing. So Mississippi is very much like a lot of states. We have regions that are probably known for bigger deer and regions known for smaller deer. Where we conducted the study, I would say right in the middle. So it wasn't in our agricultural region. It wasn't in our coastal region. It was just kind of your average place. That was a good mix of field, agriculture, and forests, which I think would be representative of the eastern half of the U.S. very well. We had a few bucks that were 2 years old in year 1. We had some that were 5 years old or greater in year 1. When we look at the average age of all the bucks, it was about 4 years of age. Okay. So we've got the middle ages and the mature ages covered pretty well.
Gotcha. And how were you able, so these are just questions I'd ask, I guess, as a scientist, looking at this, because on one side, there's probably people that are a little skeptical of science in general, maybe. So I would always say, hey, make sure you look at the test, and there's no bias in the test, right? And then on the other side, what we talked about, like our own personal bias, if we've already decided something beforehand, right? So it's both of those things being sure about. So with this test, how did you, I guess, tease out just the factor of the moon, right, and not all this other stuff that's going on during the season?
That is an excellent question, and that is very, very important. And once we started digging into how are we going to do this, how are we going to do it justice, it became very, very complicated. Now, I have to mention I had the luxury of having a colleague helping us with this. Her name is Natasha Neary, and she was uniquely qualified to do this because she's a mathematician. And so someone that's a mathematics expert and writing code and algorithm to analyze large data sets was very beneficial. So how do we tease apart? We've got all these different moon conditions going on. Moon set, moon rise, moon overhead, moon underfoot, on and on and on. How do we tease apart those parts of time to determine if they deviate from a buck's normal movement pattern? So what Natasha was able to do, which would have taken me years if I could have ever done it, she could do it with one arm tied behind her back. She basically went in and created a moving window for every single buck for every single hour of the day. 7 days prior to the condition we were looking at, 7 days after. So essentially, think about, you always have this moving average for every buck for every hour of, this is buck 297's typical behavior at 10 a.m. And she also calculated that for 11 a.m., noon, et cetera, for every single buck, for every single hour, for every single day during the hunting season. And so when you have that, you have a standard to compare against. We know what the buck is typically doing. Now we're going to add in this condition on this day at this hour where this moon is doing something, overhead, underfoot, et cetera.
Yeah.
And we see if we have a deviation from normal. So that's for one buck. Now, we don't really care about one buck. All bucks are individual. Some bucks do crazy things. What we want to do is, do we see a uniform deviation from normal for all the bucks? So you go through and you look at that condition for that hour for that buck, and then you do it for every single buck, and you take the average response of the population. And so that accounts for the time of day, the time of year, the rut phase. All that is accounted for when you analyze the data like that. So you can disentangle just the moon effect when you do that.
Yeah, and that, if you couldn't have done that, it would have been impossible.
Just about, yeah.
So that was a very key ability to do that, and just look at one variable, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
And yeah, do I see a difference versus what's normal versus, what we're seeing, the behavior here? Okay, so there's a couple of things you tested for, if I read that correctly. One basically is the phase of moon, and the other one was position of the moon.
Right.
Before we get into that, though, let me ask you real quick. How did you determine what was a significant difference of movement?
That's a good question. We really kept statistics out of this because we wanted to use effect size, deviation from norm, as our yardstick for what the difference is. And a lot of your audience may not understand this, but Adam, you're probably familiar with this, is with statistics, you have the benefit, but also the potential flaw of when you have really, really high numbers. When you have a really, really strong sample size, you can statistically detect a difference that is meaningless, that is trivial. So to put that one way, if you have a very weak data set, you've got 20 or 30 observations, a 1 pound difference in buck body weight would not be different because there's error associated, sample size is small. If you have a sample of 10,000 bucks, you can find a statistical difference in 1 pound. What that means is we did not think hunters would really care about very, very small trivial differences. So we wanted to record what is the deviation from norm and report that. To help us with that, to help us calibrate what is meaningful to hunters, we did a pre-experiment survey. And so we did that on social media. We created a survey where people could answer, and basically is, what would be meaningful to you as a hunter in terms of a deviation from normal bedding rate, a deviation from when a buck is on his feet, a deviation for the speed or velocity at which a buck is moving. And so we kind of had those as benchmarks for what a difference would be.
Gotcha. So it was.
And let me add one more thing, Adam.
Uh-huh.
During that survey, I believe the number, and you forgive me, that analysis and document has hundreds and hundreds, literally, of numbers that we found and reported. I believe from our sample, 83% of people that took the survey, assuming that is a random sample, but 83% of hunters thought the moon influenced buck movement behavior.
Yeah, I just read through that, and I think it's real close to that. So a lot of hunters believe it affects it in some way. So very relevant, to look at, obviously. So let's look at the results. So you looked at both phase and position, because those are kind of two theories, right?
Right.
And I personally have never really followed this real closely with my hunting, because personally, like I pick times off. I have times off to hunt. I'm going to hunt, right? I don't really base it around things like this. So this is a little bit new for me as well, but it looks like, there's theories around the phase, if it's new or full moon. Also, due to position in the sky, is it underfoot or overhead type thing? So as you guys tested those, what were your findings there?
Well, generally speaking, painting with a broad brush here, we found nothing. And so again, we had two different responses primarily that we looked at. The percentage of time that they were bedded during daylight hours. Now, why would that be important? If they're in the bed, you're probably not going to see them because they're not moving. So we wanted to look at, is a moon condition, is that going to affect when they're on their feet or they're in the bed? The second part of that is when they're out of the bed and they're on their feet, are they moving at a greater pace than normal? So that's essentially what we looked at. And Adam, right before we got on, I went through and did some very simplistic calculations. And so I went through in our publication the first 55 comparisons that we made. And there's probably about 75 or more total, but I went through the first 55 because those first 55 were related to moon phase interacting with moon position. So the luminosity continuum and the gravitational pull supposedly continuum. So we got all these different combinations. Now, when you look at all of those tests that we did and you take the average of them, bedding was differed by 0.2%. That was the average of all those. So we've got many tests where the response was negative. We got many tests where the response was positive, meaning they are actually bedding less. Or in some of these conditions where you say, hey, the moon is under this condition, they're going to be on their feet. We found the opposite of that. We found a negative relationship. The average of all those, when you take the positive responses, the negative responses, which are always hovering around 0 in terms of yards per hour, the average of the averages was 1.1. So both of those statistically are not differing from 0. And think about the yard per hour. What does really that mean? The manifestation of what that means. 1 yard per hour is 1 step.
Yeah.
Over an hour. That's 1 step.
Yeah, and I guess just to back up here, to set it up a little bit more, yeah, some of the argument is it's because of the luminosity, as you called it, or is it a full moon, or is it a new moon, which there'd be 0 luminosity, right? So
right.
Does that affect it? Or then the other part is it the pull of gravity? where the alignment of the moon in relation to maybe the sun as well, like might cause for some reason that extra little pull might cause a buck to get up early in the evening or maybe bed down late, so it'd give you extra chance, I guess. Is that kind of right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you combined all these factors as well. So you, in this study, you looked at individual factors like moon phase, but you also combined those things to see if there was any combination of those that might have affected it too, right?
Which that's part of the what are called the solunar tables. Mm-hmm. Some would call that the best fishing times tables. That's really a combination of those. And so when you look into those tables and those guides, there's all sorts of day ratings based on the luminosity, the visibility, moonlight, mm-hmm. and combined with the moon's position and the assumed gravitational pull, you end up over a month, you look at all these particular days, and there's some that are circled or starred as this is the ideal time. And so, yeah, all those analyses we did were based on essentially, Adam, a factorial of disentangling all those different combinations and looking at them and just seeing what the average response is.
Gotcha. And there's also one, I think it's similar to the solar or solunar table, the red moon phenomenon or that theory. Yeah. Is that, so that would be when I think the moon and sun setting kind of align. So you guys looked at that as well?
Yeah, and I believe, don't quote me on this, but I think the best red moon is going to be when you have, during a crepuscular time period, either the sun is coming up or the sun is setting, and you have moon overhead or moon underfoot. That is supposed to be a red moon day and red moon time. And I do have that number right in front of me. So under that condition, with all those bucks over both years, we did see a decrease in bedding time for the day. The decrease was 0.4%. And we did see an increase in deer movement during that time. It was 3 yards per hour. So 3 steps in an hour.
Gotcha. So you guys concluded, and this would be more than just you working on this, right? That was not significant enough to say that was affecting their movement, right? Because again, what was the error one way or another could be positive or negative. So you're saying basically, what would be significant would have been much more than that from your perspective.
Well, my perspective, as well as the people that we surveyed, with what would you expect? And I believe, there was a scale. Some people said, hey, if this thing really works, deer ought to be moving an additional 100 to 200 yards in an hour. They really need to be on their feet. And you had some, and I think this may have been the average, was a little over 50 yards per hour is what you should have. But what we saw on the average of all these tests, so with red moon, we saw 3. That's a deviation from 50. And on the average of all these tests, we saw 1. 1 yard per hour difference based on moon condition.
Gotcha. Was there anything that stood out in these tests that, someone would say, or you might say, hey, maybe that, is interesting, or we want to look at that a little bit more? Was there any certain condition that could be maybe give a little advantage? I'm not talking huge, right? I think you mentioned in there it's definitely not comparable to the rut, right, as far as that getting buck movement. But was there any certain condition that was just maybe a little bit more than any others? Because just looking at it here, said something like found when moon rising or setting, bed down 7 minutes later than usual was one of the findings. And I think that was during what they call a minor window. So would that be one of those that is a maybe, or is that not even that that much in your thought?
I think you have to put that in the interpretation of the hunter and the way you hunt. Would that be meaningful to you? To me, I'm very much like you, Adam. I have few days to hunt, and it's more about when I have time off, and I have time off, and I'm going to go regardless. But when we were doing the survey and reaching out to people that make their living literally with killing deer and killing bucks, they will say, if there's anything at all that can give me an advantage, if I'm hunting and if they're going to take 2 more steps, and those 2 steps give me a shot in daylight hours, then that's meaningful to me. So, that they can take that and use that. I would love for them to take that and use that for a couple of years and just see how successful they were and see if it really manifested in success. The other part of this, Adam, is not to get too much in the weeds with statistics stuff, but anytime you roll the dice, a whole bunch, random chance comes into play. And it's the same way when you run a whole bunch of statistical tests. Random chance every once in a while, you're going to find that was a pretty big effect. And I don't even know which stat I'm referring to in terms of what moon condition this relates to, but there was one of those of the 55 tests that were run, there was one of them where yards per hour increased by 22 yards per hour. But that is paired, the very next test we did, there was negative 13 yards per hour. The next one is positive 9. The next one after that is negative 5. And so you see, when you run these over and over again, random chance is going to manifest. And so that's why I really wanted to let's remove some of those instances where you might have random chance, and let's look at it all put together. And when you put it all together, it's 1 step in an hour.
Yeah. So, for whitetail hunters thinking the orientation of the moon will cause a buck to get up hours early and hit their plot, it doesn't appear so. Specifically, there just isn't significant data or scientific reasoning regarding that the position or the gravitational pull of the moon affects terrestrial animals or their movements at all. No organ in the deer detects this pull that we know of, and there's no reason biologically that it would be of any benefit to do so. 2 other historic signals for increased buck movement, cold fronts and the rut, are by far more influential and can be backed with significant data. This probably won't eliminate the debate, but from what we now know, putting all your chips on how the moon is hanging in the sky probably isn't your best bet at predicting a buck encounter. Okay, if you liked this video, make sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification button so you know when our next episode's out. And if you're listening, make sure to follow, rate, and review, and share this with a buddy you may think will benefit. That really helps the podcast grow and is greatly appreciated. Also, check out our services that help you actually dial in on things that will really help you to be a much more consistent and better deer hunter. Those include land plans and coaching services, even for public land hunters. Check those out below. All right, and I'll see you on the next Deer IQ High IQ video as we get into and finish our public land series. You won't want to miss that, and I'll see you then.